Welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar, working with trans and gender diverse people. My name is Sheridan and I'm the facilitator of today's webinar. These webinars are hosted by Turning Point and they're funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. So welcome. Before we get into the content of the webinar today, I want to acknowledge that we are recording this webinar on Aboriginal land. It's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and so I want to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also extend respect to any Aboriginal people who are watching with us today. So this webinar, I'm really grateful that we have two incredible guests with us today. Wanted to start today by just acknowledging that with a topic like this, although you will be receiving incredible information and some tips and what we might consider best practice and maybe gain some new perspective, we also know it's not a topic that you're unlikely to walk away today feeling like you're an expert on this topic. It's just not that kind of topic. So what we hope for is that after this webinar today, you will walk away with some new information and some new ideas about how to serve this community, but that also you'll be inspired to look for more information, do some more reading, talk to people in your teams, look at the processes that you've got in place currently and really reflect on some of the ideas that will be presented here today. And also, we imagine you might do some self-reflecting as well to look at where maybe you have assumptions, maybe you have unconscious bias and those kinds of things. So really wanted to frame that up. But the other thing is that there is a lot of information that you can continue to research, you can continue to read, and I just wanted to start by pointing you in the direction of where you might find some of those with us today. So we've put up some PDFs of some information that you can download. If you have a look on your screen in the right top hand corner of your screen, you're going to see a little icon that's got a little pointing down symbol. So that's the downloads icon. If you click on that downloads icon, you'll see that there's some PDFs in there. And so they'll be referenced today in the presentation. The other thing you'll find in there is a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides that you're going to see today in this presentation. And so you can go ahead and download those resources and those articles and also the PowerPoint slides. And the PowerPoint slides have got some URLs on a couple of those pages as well, so there's further reading for you to do there. And you can download those at any time. You can do it now or you can do it towards the end. You just won't be able to do that obviously once the webinar has closed off. So do go ahead and do those whenever you can, and that will give you some further reading and further resources. The other thing that we've got today, the format's slightly different. We've asked you to submit some questions, and we've never done this before at registration point, and I'm really heartened actually that people have asked questions that really kind of gave us the feedback that you are wanting more information and you're wanting to do good work, and obviously first do no harm in this kind of work. So we've got those questions. I've got those with us today, and I'm going to be presenting those questions to the guests today. But at the same time, you've got a section within the webinar profile that you can actually ask questions if you're live with us today. So you'll see it again up the top right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little ask a question symbol, which is the blue hand. If you wanted to make a comment, if you wanted to ask a question or seek clarification and you're live with us today, you can go ahead and do that. Again, at any point, just type that straight in the chat box. Part of my role is to facilitate and collect all those questions and comments. I've got an iPad here, so I'll just be looking at those and I'll try and interject those throughout the presentation, but also we'll try and make time at the end to ask specific questions. And just finally, before we kind of get into the content, there's a yellow little speech bubble kind of icon there as well. We really love to get your feedback. I would love to get your comments and feedback, and we do have a quick feedback survey for that. So if you could do that before you leave the webinar today. If you can't stay all the way to the end, you're with us live and you have to log off before you leave, if you could just click on the yellow icon, jump in and give us some feedback. That would be really, really helpful. because we know this is especially this topic, we're going to look at what else we could do to kind of help AOD clinicians in Victoria to make sure they're doing really good work with trans and gender diverse people. So thanks for staying with me on all the logistics of all of that. So what I wanted to do next is introduce introduce both of our guests today. First of all, a person who maybe needs no introduction because they're so well known in Melbourne. This is Sally Goldner, and Sally has been involved in Victoria's LGBTIQA community for over 20 years. And she's a spokesperson for Transgender Victoria, which is why, particularly we've asked her to come today. And we're so grateful that she has the time to do that. She co-facilitates Transfamily, a peer support group for parents, siblings and extended friends and family of trans people. She's the treasurer for Bisexual Alliance Victoria, and she also presents a weekly show on 3CR radio station called Out of the Pan, which is on at 2 p.m. every Sunday, so definitely listen into that. I can't believe you have time to even be here with all that going on. So much.
There's coffee.
There's coffee, yes.
Minor correction, it is noon on Sundays.
Noon, is it? That's changed. Okay,
yep.
Noon on. So thank you for that. So 12 p.m., not 2 p.m.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And I'm so grateful, and it's very special that we also have Christy Rohr. Mm-hmm. And Christy has a passion for all things social justice and storytelling. And Christy has self-selected to be here today. I put a call out for anybody who who identifies as non-binary, who also has a lived experience of alcohol and other drugs and using the alcohol and other drugs service system here in Victoria. And so Christy has come along today, and I am very, very, very grateful to answer your questions, because I'm not an expert in this area, and it's really important that we hear from people who have a lived experience, because they are experts in their world. So we'll be hearing from Christy when we go to those questions as well that you've all submitted. So what I want to do now is I do want to hand over to Sally. Sally has graciously, and probably it's not been an easy task, taken a face-to-face training that she normally delivers, which is a few hours. Usually,
2 hours.
2 hours. And I've told her she can have like 10, 15 minutes maybe. And so she's actually cut that down. So normally you'd have to pay and go to Sally's face-to-face training, at a venue. But she's taken a bit of a snapshot of that training, and she's going to present that for us today, just to give people some introduction and some overview around this topic and about what's most important. So I'm going to hand over to Sally now.
Thanks, Sheridan. And thank you, everyone who's joined us today from whichever lands you are on, and that Sheridan has very much acknowledged where we are. There's one other thing I'd like to speak to on this, and that is that language in this presentation is very much of a Western or colonial nature, and that there have been people doing all forms of gender identity and expression on these lands and all over the world since humanity began. A good resource is the PBS Interactive Gender Map. That's the American Public Broadcasting System, as much as there's another good community radio station here in Melbourne with the same initials. So we do acknowledge that. So sometimes when people say to us in their talkback commercial radio caller voice, this is a very new thing, this transgender. No, it isn't. And we've been here since humanity got underway. I'm not going to spend every moment on every slide. As stated, this is a 2-hour presentation that's been condensed. I'm just going to pick out important bits. That is your legal backup. Go with federal law. It's better than the Victorian state law, so you'll be doing above the minimum, which is all the so-called positive duty. The critical part of that slide is that this is an area that's growing. People find their own sense of identity or expression. We're not going to focus so much on sexual orientation today, and that's great. The more sense of diversity there is, people can find their true authentic self. And that's why we've got that in yellow. This is no means exhaustive, objective, wholly representative or static, and particularly objective words can mean different things to different people. It's what resonates and hits in a really heartfelt way. I won't spend a lot of time on this one, which is more sexual and romantic orientation. but noting that there are an increasing number of people who are finding a sense of being asexual, where they don't experience sexual attraction, and aromantic, where they don't experience romantic attraction. And, you know, a trans person can have any sexual and or romantic attraction, the same as the broader population. Worth noting that at a conference I was at last month, asexual people said they found out more about asexuality through fan fiction than they did through sex education, which is extremely, well, there's dry humour in it, but it's also worrying that there is that lack of education. Even the Asexual Visibility Education Network is a good website there. I'll spend a little more time on intersex because often when people talk about the diversity in the communities we're focusing on, that's the least understood. Many times in our sessions people say they've never heard the word. So that definition is in quotes because it's from the website for Intersex Human Rights Australia, and it simply is where, in simple terms, in a birth ward, and the first thing we always ask, male or female, there's a pause because someone isn't sure. And so the body is visibly different, as it says there, but sometimes people with intersex variations don't find out till puberty when hormones don't happen as expected. Or later on, a common example is where a couple's trying to have children, it's not happening, they go to a fertility clinic and get chromosome tests, and someone comes up with X chromosome or XXY. That's another form of variation. So it can be external, it can be hormonal or genetic. And the two people pictured there, I hope that's bottom's left slide is coming through, where it says council chambers. Tony Briffer is a councillor on the city of Hobsons Bay to the west of Melbourne's CBD, has been for many years, and an absolute Australian pioneer, and someone who's been in the world news, sadly against her own will. Caster Semenya, the South African runner, also has an intersex variation. So just to give an idea of that. So just a little more time on that because it is often the least perhaps understood really of the whole, inverted commas, rainbow communities. But that is the focus obviously for today. Trans and gender diverse, where someone differs, and I've highlighted those words, society's expectations. If we are easily able to define someone as male or female at birth, we then lump expectations on. They'll see themselves as male, for example, in terms of their identity. They'll express themselves in what society, I will say rightly or wrongly, calls masculine ways in terms of their clothing or behaviour. And similarly, female body, female identity, feminine. Of course, we've got three separate things there. They don't automatically flow from one to the other. I've put three pictures up there, and the serious way of explaining those, from left to right, Georgie Stone, someone who could use the term trans woman. In the middle, Chaz Bono, child of Sonny and Cher, who's a trans man, and Ruby Rose, who identifies as gender fluid. And if I can inject one sense of humour, someone in a presentation once said, can act, can probably act, can't act, that's a little unfair. So I think it shows a spectrum and diversity even within trans and gender diverse. There's a lot of talk about trans women. We'll hear from someone who identifies as non-binary, but sometimes trans men get invisibilised, and this can create stress in medical settings where a trans man walks into a clinic and has to say out loud, why are you here? I need a pap smear, that sort of thing. So that can create stress, and it may lead to, we'll say, excessive use of alcohol because of that constant having to explain and the discrimination. One thing that is the situation is someone is trans regardless of whether they've had a surgery or surgeries or not, whether they've taken hormones or not, whether they've made a permanent affirmation of a different gender to expectations. So that's why we use umbrella. Lots of different people with a similar theme but somewhat different sheltering under the umbrella. There is no one way to be trans, they're all valid. And the same for anyone's labels, by the way. Some people say, there's an older term, I don't use it myself, transsexual, and some people say you can't use it, it's too medical. Well, you can't take away someone's term, and the more terms there are, the better it is, I think. It just enriches people's sense of finding their authentic self. I myself identify as a trans woman in this area and use the pronoun she, her. I'm not going to spend mountains of time on these. These are there for your reference. I'll just explain the cryptic figures after each reference. Number of participants, when released, age range covered, and percent non-binary. And I think that last one is critical, because if you look at that one which I've put there as the most recent, 48.6%, and there's been a couple of pieces released since which still showed at around 50%, which reinforces the idea of gender being a spectrum or a kaleidoscope. And there's some ones beyond Australia, and I really want to point to those figures highlighted in the middle. When someone can't be themselves, the thoughts, difficult topic as it is, and please, I know I'm talking to clinicians, but please check in if there is anything that's upsetting. 81%, as per that combined Irish research, had thoughts before they could be themselves of suicide. But look at it, once you're just on the way and getting affirmed, 4%. And this is why a seminar like today is so critical, that it could not only help someone with their health mentally and physically on alcohol and other substances, it could turn their life around. There's some more. I do want to acknowledge that lots of communities have mental health challenges, newly arrived, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but that is a quote. And so rather than focus on who's doing worse, it just shows that all communities who face discrimination can often have mental health challenges, and that in turn could lead to substance issues. There's some outcomes from that. Note the Trans Pathways one, which is for 14 to 25-year-olds, and look at those high figures in relation to mental health. The one thing that isn't on that slide is where someone has parental or guardian support, all those figures drop, which makes sense. Things that people face, often the discrimination is intense and there's many incidents of it. The family one's changing, just to pluck a few at random. Changing identity documents, well, we've reached somewhat of a turning point in that 5 of Australia's 8 states and territories have good birth certificate laws, and Victoria's changes that went through Parliament in August last year come into force on May the 1st. So that can be a really affirming thing, to have documentation that really matches who you are. But of course there is so much overt gendering of everything, blue bonnets and pink bonnets and how we play sport, and boys over there for football, girls for netball. Excuse me while I take a deep breath or something. Yeah. So this is what causes issues for trans and gender diverse people, is the either or mentality of society. We very much acknowledge that people are multifaceted and may play into it. We sadly are aware of the discrimination that people of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander backgrounds face. But they're not automatically factors. Some people are fine. There's a couple I'd pick out there. Neurodiversity. Some Transgender Victoria did a project on respectful relationships last year, and 50% of the people in our focus groups found neurodiversity, whether it's autism. I personally identify with the highly sensitive person trait. Despite the fact that I'm here with you for an hour, I'm an introvert, I'll need my downtime afterwards. Neuroprocessing, neurodiversity, really important to many people and has to come into it. And one that doesn't get enough attention, 2/3 of people who are sex workers are LGBTIQA+. And so it is about being respectful to all parts of a person to assist them. Cisgender, where someone's sense of gender identity meets expectations. Cis is Latin for on the same side as, and these are some issues that people can face that can lead to stress. There are variations across age cohorts. One of the things we're finding, for example, we're getting lots of feedback off the ground that trans women in the middle cohort, say 30 to 60 give or take, can lose their supports when they come out, and that can be a stress factor, could lead to misuse of substances or overuse. And older people may be in stealth. They've gone through their journey, don't want to talk about it, but many people are very resilient. And that's where I think we're pausing there, so hopefully that's given a very quick overview. And I will just throw in, if you do have questions as you go along, sometimes people get scared, or I don't know what words to use, so they don't ask a question. If you have that, just put it as best as you can, so long as it's coming from a place of wanting to learn. We can then answer your question, but in my best late night television voice, you can also get how to ask the question better for when you're working with clients, which we call the bonus set of steak knives or tofu knives, because we're food diverse as well. So please feel free to ask the questions. We'd rather you ask, and if there is such a thing in inverted commas as a wrong question, better to do it in here than when you're working with a client, because that's where we can work through it with you. So that's my brief overview. I'll take a breath, grab a glass of water, and we'll hear very importantly next from Christy.
So what we're going to do next is, and I've kind of chatted to Christy about this, is that we're going to look at the questions that the registrants have put into the mix. So when people registered for this webinar, there was a free text box, and that's something different that we're doing now. So you could ask your questions, and we do have questions that have been asked prior to today. So I have checked in with Christy and also Sally about whether we could position those questions to you, and so we've agreed that probably will work best to hear from somebody with a lived experience. So I might go ahead and ask you the first question and see what you think. So, I mean, as somebody who does identify as, and I know I'm going to use your language here about that you identify as someone who has recovered from alcohol and drug addiction, and that's your language. And I say that just because some people will not use the word addiction, and so I want to be clear for everybody that's watching today as well. And then alongside that, you're also a person who identifies as non-binary as well, and that you have received supports throughout the AOD service sector as well. So the first question that did come through was, what has been helpful, or what would have been helpful for you from a clinician when responding to your disclosure of being non-binary?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parts to that question.
So much, yeah.
I think one of the most helpful things is to have trans and non-binary people working for your organisation, to be culturally competent as an organisation, but also, like, for myself, as a non-binary person, as a trans person, I am hypersensitive to my environment. I am hypersensitive to whether or not I disclose, and I will always opt for risk aversion. So for the most part, I will opt not to disclose, because it's been my experience not to put too much trust or faith in any sort of organisation, just in spite of their policies and procedures, that they're able to hold the container of my own personal complicated relationship with gender. It's a lot for me to hold. So my response generally is I don't expect other people to be able to hold it, and that's the safest option for me. But I think in terms of being what is the best possible outcome is for someone to believe me when I tell them what my experience is, and also to go away and do their own research and maybe check in with me about things, and when I say something, to be able to hear what I'm saying and not become defensive to what I'm saying. You know, simple things like getting my pronouns right is just gives me such a hit of dopamine. It's a really simple thing, but it makes an incredible difference. So I don't expect anywhere I go or anyone I speak to understand the complexities of my internal experience in the same way that I can't understand someone else's through having lived it, but I can believe them when they could tell me what those experiences are, and I can ask, you know, inquiring questions, and be open to being wrong or to being guided in another direction. Does that go to answer the question?
Yeah, okay. And I think that it's really also speaking to something that we had spoken about recently, where I know from delivering other kinds of training about, like, diversity training, that many times clinicians will kind of come from this response. They're used to being the expert, and especially because many people kind of think through a medical model lens, and they really do want to do good work.
Yep.
but they come to that work with that sense of I've got expertise that I'm going to apply here. They need to be able to step back and say, okay, this is something I don't know that, you're the expert in your world, and really let their defences down and really go. I mean, it's a place of vulnerability, I think, for clinicians, but allowing the non-binary person to lead. You are the expert, and they need to learn about your world from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a common experience that I've done.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few quick bounce-offs from me there. That one thing trans people, trans and gender diverse people, and probably anyone of any diverse background doesn't want is to be the non-consensual educator where at the end they say, thank you, now we're going to charge you $80 or $240 or whatever it is. And that stops people accessing healthcare and support in all sorts of things. I can also relate to what you said about yourself, Christy, as someone who lived 29 years without having the right information about myself, and every time I tried to be myself, I was told things, you know, that are because of my expectations, toughen up, that sort of stuff, and not getting it. Sometimes there's still feelings that come up in service provision and other settings of mistrust and abandonment, and that can be big things, I think, for trans people, as are lots of feelings. And third, I would much rather a health professional say, look, I don't know, can you point me to a couple of references that you think are good and I'll read on my own time, much preferred rather than having to be the educator. I would prefer that humility, if you like.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can't know everything about everything. We don't have heads that are automatically filled with knowledge when we're born, but if someone's open to learning, has that value of curiosity, that's a great thing for diversity and things generally.
Definitely.
Beautiful,
Well said.
beautiful, yeah. And I think also on that point too is that I think for especially non-binary people, I think it's a daily, it's daily. Like it's not, I think it's different. I think some people think that that, you know, like having a different gender expression, a gender identity is just kind of the same as having a different sexuality. So the coming out for people who maybe come out as gay or queer or lesbian, or, you know, there's a coming out that usually happens maybe once, maybe a lot over and over to different people, but for trans and non-binary people, it's that constant kind of journey, because it's on a daily basis. You're figuring this out, you're responding to your own internal kind of dialogue and your own needs. It's not something that's, once you've done it once, it's done. It's constant.
No, it is constant, and it's really messy, and I speak of my own experience only when I say this, but my relationship to my gender is very, very messy, and I feel I struggle a lot with imposter syndrome. I struggle a lot with dysphoria and decisions that I want to make around my body, what decisions I don't want to make, if I just want to go in the opposite direction of the way that I'm forced to be, because at least I can be seen as something different because I'm forced to be in this place all the time. What's real for me? What's a response to my external, the external input that I get? It's all, like, that's from the time I get up in the morning. That's daily. And there's not a lot of relief. And there's, you know, I was speaking to you before, Sheridan, about having a connection to story and mythology is who we are as people is really, really important. You know, I love story. I'm a storyteller. And feeling very disconnected from, like, what is my history here? What am I connected to? What is the mythology that's guiding me? What are these archetypes that I can connect to? It feels very disparate and sometimes like a little bit lost. Yeah, I'll leave it on that.
And so for people to know that, to understand even just that idea, that's actually your daily, and you said before, like you from the moment you wake up, there's all of that going on. So there is a relationship to your body where you can experience body dysphoria and this sense of being lost and not having any kind of frame.
Yeah.
And then walking out into the world and everything being very much binary, like extreme, you know, and you walk into a medical setting and the first thing that you're asked about is your gender, you know, and that is binary, and the ways that you're treated and how you're, you know, how people read you in the world. So it's constant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think that the next question, maybe you've already answered it as well, so, but I'll just put it out in the space. Why is it important that clinicians ask, or I suppose ask or respond? Is it important that clinicians ask questions, ask about, I don't know, ask about gender, ask about pronouns? What do either of you think about that?
I think Sally will probably have some really good things to say, but I guess I want the option to opt in and opt out. And if I also want people to know that I'm opting out because there is a reason that I'm opting out.
Yeah.
So does that give you any clarity?
I think, I think that's beautiful. And I think also that if we can all remember that, and I think there is a really great question actually coming that somebody gave us as well that will kind of help us unpack this a little bit more. But if people can remember that if somebody is choosing not to disclose, that's actually an act of resilience. It's not something that you know, it is a choice, and many times it's a powerful choice. I think what we need to remember is that if somebody opts out of disclosing things, it's not a reflection on, you know, how much rapport you're building or not building with that person, but in that, and obviously we're going to talk more about things you can do to help build that rapport, but it is about building safety. And if you know somebody is maybe not disclosing things to you, you have kind of sense that, then you need to see that as an act of resilience. It's an act of strength. If somebody is safety planning constantly, that is, and they know how to do that, they've learned how to do that, then that is an act of resilience. But also take into consideration the energy it takes to continuously be scanning your environment and to be continuously putting those safety measures in place. So the disclosing, not disclosing, I think, because it's come up in other trainings that I've been in before, where I've been delivering trainings and it's come up, I'm always saying, like, you have to remember that person is an expert in their world. If they're not reading that the environment is safe, then you have to respect that, and you and respect the fact that is a strength that they are able to do that. Yeah,
definitely.
And so maybe the next question we've kind of, I suppose the next one I might put to Sally, if that's okay, Sally. Why do you think that clinicians struggle to engage with the topic even? About the trans and non-binary, I suppose, is what the person's asking.
I think overwhelmingly that people across society want to do the right thing and be respectful to people, but they're not sure how to do it, maybe because of misinformation they've heard from some sources, say media or politicians or something. I think it's too hard, and really it isn't. And if it comes from a place of respect and authenticity and wanting to learn, that's okay. So if someone, you know, we will pick up, you know, we pick up on the details. If someone's not sure and takes a wild guess at our gender, then that's problematic. And we'd rather you say, look, I want to be respectful to you. Could I, if you're okay to tell me which pronouns do you use, if any, by and large, transgender diverse people will leap at that and go, this person is thinking about us. Similarly, there's other things you can do before the person's even sat down in front of you. If your service has rainbow and trans emblems on its website, that's a good thing. It's also about the receptionist being aware. Bad B-grade acting coming up, but I ring up and go, I need to make an appointment with Dr. Smith. Yes, sir, what's your name? I'm just going to go, for older people like me, we'll put the phone down. For modern people, we'll click the button on our smartphone. Let's replay that. Like to make an appointment with Dr. Smith. Yeah, sure, can I get your name, please? Now, if I say Sally, you're probably going to guess that it's female, and you'll probably be right. But if someone rings up and says, yeah, Sam, you don't know if it's Sam or Samantha, you might need to ask. That sort of thing. These things are important. And the other one, I've made honest mistakes with gender because I call it residual gender programming. We see someone saying with simple terms, long hair and a colourful dress, and I defaulted to she, and the person, quite rightly, it was at a seminar, put their hand up and said, I use they, them pronouns because I'm non-binary. And I just said, I'm sorry, I got that wrong, I'll get it right from now on, which is the practice. Yeah. And that's okay too. So those things can get us in the door and staying in the door and are really important to us. And I'm not sure how we're going with the close-ups, but I've got a couple of little rainbow badges of sorts on, those sorts of things, lanyards, badges, whatever. There's no official government approved insignia, but if we see something like that, one of the words that came up for me a few months ago, hypervigilant. We've learned to be hypervigilant to survive, but if we can turn that skill to a positive, we see these little things that are like having the 100 metre by 100 metre rainbow flag on the roof, we will warm somewhat overall. So there's a few thoughts that are basics, and then you can just get on with the work that you have to do about engaging with the client.
Thanks, Sally. The next question, maybe I'll just throw it out and either of you can respond if you like, but the question is, what is the best way, and I think I already know the answer to this, but what is the best way to ascertain if a new client is trans and or gender diverse?
I think that the thing that I always ask is gender, including trans and gender diverse, relevant? And you might get some ideas, you might have, and I'll be very careful in my language here, some guesses that, you might see something about the client, that sort of thing. But it's best not to assume anything. And then if you think it's relevant, that's the only time to ask. But if the person's there to talk about other things, then be guided by the client. And this is where we'll have this slide towards the end, but, being an ally to someone is the same for anyone else. Just be there and be in the present moment with the person, with what they need to talk about at that time, and engage them. And so it might not be relevant. People, trans and gender diverse people, face other things in their life that could lead to alcohol and other drug use. So always check in, but it might be that, sadly, also a young person was thrown out of home because they were trans, and that led to their substance situation. So those sorts of things could be factors.
The next question is, I have found, so this is from a clinician working in rehab, I found that some clients that are in the rehab setting, may declare their gender and or their sexuality to staff, but then they won't declare it to other clients when they're in rehab. I honour their choice, but then I'm wondering if you can say if this could have an impact on their recovery from substance use issues and also their mental health well-being. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does. It's a lot to pull apart, that question. And I mean, speaking from my own personal experience of recovery, like learning how to honour your own truth is an ongoing journey. It's not something that you do in a day, and it's a life's work. And for me, part of having good recovery is about learning how to live a life that is in line with my values and honest but not an honesty for other people, an honesty for me. So me walking into a situation or a group setting or whatever it is, and choosing not to disclose certain things about myself is, as Sheridan said, one of the most resilient things I can do, because I can make informed decisions, because I can think clearly through the situation, I can internally safety plan, I can do all those things that lead to better outcomes and better safety for me. So, and then there are other times where I feel like, and especially, I'm part of a 12-step recovery group, and part of the things that I'm always thinking about is how do I make this place a safe place for TGD folks, because at the moment it's not. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No, you're on it.
Can you back me up?
Yeah.
What was I?
Yeah, so we're talking about if the person discloses to maybe their clinician, but then when they're places like rehab or in group situations, they don't disclose to others. Does that impact recovery and well-being?
No.
Yeah, I think that's right.
No,
that's the answer.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I might chip in, there's a few scenarios that came to mind in group settings. The thing is, I don't know who else is around in a broad public setting. To give an example of really bad practice, so hear it and then throw it out, until a few years ago, a major Victorian government agency that's critical for identity documents didn't have a trans policy. So a trans person would walk in to change their name and gender and walk up to the counter and someone would go, "Hey Fred, got a trans person here, what do we do?"
Wow.
Fail.
Wow.
You don't know who's in the waiting area, and that can be really critical. There was also a situation, I don't think the person was trans, but I think were gay or lesbian in a public housing setting. Oh, come out to everyone. No, you've got to work out whether it's safe. And so that's why people may not want to disclose to other stuff, and only disclose to a limited range of people. You just don't know who's there. But also the thing where they're, just to give the good policy, is I did work with a crisis accommodation organisation. I will give them credit. It was Hanover before they moved with Homeground to become Launch. And they have a policy that every client will respect any other client in simple language, on all attributes: skin colour, race, faith, gender identity. And so that sort of thing, to have a policy like that and have it displayed on a website, on a wall in the waiting area, is a little helpful. But it still doesn't mean we have to disclose, of course, as you said, opt-in or opt-out, which is every individual's call.
Beautiful, thank you.
Said.
Yeah, that was great. I'm going to jump to, I'm just watching time, so I'm going to jump down. I just wanted to hit on this point. There's a question here asking at what time in the assessment, so that's referring to the intake and assessment process. In Victoria, there's a process and there's some documents that go along with the intake and assessment process. Do we ask the person if they're trans or gender diverse? The intake forms are really limited and there's limited prompts to do this, but I'd really like to make sure I'm doing it right without offending people. Look, because these webinars are funded by the state funding, and I think I know there's like 400 people signed up for this webinar today, and I can see from all the email addresses a whole heap of you are actually outside of Victoria. But I suppose I'll speak to the very quickly just to the intake and assessment form. I just photocopied the front of the intake form. It does, the very first thing that it asks you is about the demographics of the person, and back in 2016 there was a process of review of these intake and assessment forms, and there was community consultation, and within the community consultation things like pronouns and gender identification were brought up as something that was missing from the old forms. So they've been updated. I think what I want to say here too is that it's good to remember that this was like the upgrade of these forms to include gender identity and include asking somebody if they have a preferred pronoun, which is what the wording is. Is there a preferred pronoun? That was actually brought from the community. That was a community response. So if you ask somebody about do they have a preferred pronoun and somebody doesn't understand what you're talking about, you can give a bit of a preamble and you can say, look, we've learned through community consultation or through like a review of these forms that it's really important that we ask people about gender identity and we ask them about pronoun. You don't have to, it's not required, but so I want to ask, did you want to tell me a pronoun that you prefer while you're working with us? So just to put that out there, because I know some people are confused why it got added onto the intake forms, but that there is a section there that is straight up that is asks for gender identification. The options it gives on the intake form is just a tick box, and it says male, female and other, and under beside other it says please specify, and you've got room to write in there. So that's first up on the form. However, what I also know is most of the intake, that's intake, and the intake forms are mostly completed over the phone, and I understand that sometimes clinicians feel like that they're not real, like a lot of times people are not going to disclose at that point, I think, because you haven't built rapport yet, and so that's okay. Like these kinds of things will come up at other stages. So for instance, I know sometimes it'll come up, people's, somebody's non-binary status might come up when you're talking about, you're doing a genogram of their family in that section of the assessment forms. You ask about family, you ask about social supports, you ask about like the social economic kind of supports that are in that person's life, and there's questions around that. You might hear, for instance, that somebody got kicked out of home and through those areas, or maybe in the section 6 where you're asking about risks, you'll hear risk of homelessness, and the risk of homelessness might be related to things like they share their story of that they came out as non-binary and they were told that to leave home. So you're going to, like anything, when you're unpacking and you're building a relationship with people that you're going to be working with, you have so many opportunities to respond, but that there is at the very top of the intake form in the demographic section, you are asked there. And so if throughout the intake and assessment, you learn, later on in comprehensive assessment that a person has non-binary or they're trans status, then you can say, oh, well, I want to check with you what's your preferred pronoun, and you can add that, go back and add that later. But there is a section that's also in that demographic section that I actually will say to people not to ask. So if somebody identifies themselves as non-binary or transgender, the question underneath gender identification is asking sex assigned at birth. And I will say to people, if you know somebody, especially if you know somebody is non-binary or transgender, you don't ask that question. It's not appropriate. It can be harmful. Now, some people will say to me that they are told they have to ask that question, and it's true that in the clinician guide that supports the intake and assessment documents, it does say that you are required to ask it because it's for data collection. I've actually researched, looked at why that is, and the reason that it is said that you need to ask it is because of, it's come from a medical kind of probably frame, I'd say, where it's a way of checking that there's not duplicate records for patients. So that's kind of where it comes from. So the data, the kind of, the inference that you're meant to ask it because it's something that's important. It's not important. It's actually just because it's left over from that kind of process of making sure you don't have two files not in your service, but within Victoria for the one person who might be seeking service. And the other thing, the final thing I say about that is everybody should have, you should have the clinician guide. The clinician guide obviously is downloadable as well from the DHHS website. I'm losing those words. But in there, it says when you go to the section about demographics, beside that section, in line with that section about asking those questions around things like sex assigned at birth, it says, you're required to ask it for VADC data reporting requirements, but then it goes on to say, but as with all questions within the tool, the data elements for reporting should be collected with due consideration to whether collecting the information during the assessment will detrimentally impact the treatment and the engagement of the client. So you have that, you have the ability to make that choice to not ask that question.
Yeah.
I wanted to check to see if you want to add anything to that as well.
Right on target there, that for this purpose to ask it isn't relevant. If, for example, we were talking about sexual health, then you might need to ask a question about how someone was assigned at birth, and this is where language is important about inclusive language. You'd ask, what genitals do you have, rather than assuming someone has a penis or a vagina or something else. And this is again another of those little things where our hypervigilance comes in, and it's the 100 metre by 100 metre rainbow flag. Language where you say all genders rather than both genders, those sorts of things, just little things where we'll go, okay, this organisation and this practitioner is at least thinking about us, and if something does go amok, just a little off track, I know we can have a chance of fixing it. They're the sort of things we look for,
Beautiful, thank you.
Lots of questions, and I just noticed there are some.
And we do have some questions coming in live. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one more question from the registrants, and then we might have a few of the questions from the people who are with us live.
Sum up.
Yes, exactly. We could do this all day.
We could go for a long time.
I suppose if I just run down the list, I'll ask one of the last questions. Oh yes, this one. How to approach members of staff who are homophobic and also speak of gender diverse people in a negative way. Do you have any tips, Sally?
Yeah, look, I'm a firm believer in there's a phrase, trying to call people in first. People have heard things, they might have heard myths. As I said, much as I hate to say it, there is that thing out there called commercial media, which sometimes, allegedly, in someone's opinion, puts clickbait and ratings points and newspaper sales ahead of truth. And sometimes myths get into people's heads and they're hard to uproot, but at least give it a shot. But so that's what I'll call the carrot, and then the stick is that slide that came in right at the start, the federal anti-discrimination law that works all around the country. You have to treat people with respect and on their merits. You can't treat them less favourably. And if your staff are homo, bi, transphobic in, say the staff room or something, then that to me is a cockpit warning light flashing. And if they're not open to learning, that's that theme again, then you might have to talk to their manager or your people and culture team and let them handle it, which I'm sure they'd manage. So always try to give people a shot. I'm a firm believer that people don't know what they don't know, and sometimes they go through a process before they get to they know what they know. And people have beliefs that build up, but if they're too resistant, then you might have to ask, are they really people to be working in a field where human skill and empathy are so important anyway?
Well said.
I think I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, I think about that. That's the work you came to do. If you came to work in the the humanities field and you came to support and serve people, then first do no harm is the very first kind of motto that you take on.
Do no harm for all people of all backgrounds.
That's right. Yeah. I'm going to jump to, thank you for everybody for participating and putting in those questions. I'm sorry that I couldn't get through all of them, but I believe that a lot of the questions were covered in some of the content we've already delivered. So if anyone's got any queries though, you can always email me. I'm just seeing all these messages as well saying that the PowerPoints aren't downloading, so if Redback could please upload our PowerPoints for people to be able to download. But what I might do is email everybody on the list as well with a copy. So if you can't see them in the download box, then I will be emailing them after this. His question. So a first question from Maria is, could you just talk a little bit more about this term transsexual, because is it a bad word?
No, it's not a bad word.
Yeah.
For a lot of people in the middle and senior cohort, it's the only word they had to give them some sense of connection and hope and moving forward. And so there can be a generation gap in very generalised terms on this, where some younger people will say it is a medicalised term. It's bad. We don't want to be medicalised as such and pathologised. But you can't say to that 50 or 55-year-old, you can't use that anymore. Find something else. You just can't. There are, and there. I'm a believer in mentioning small elephants in the room, or as in the interest of diversity, Canadians called it the moose on the table. There is the word tranny. Now, 99.99999% of the time, that's a word you wouldn't use. But if someone if they say that is my term with hand on heart, so to speak, that's what you use. So you can't say someone can't use a term, but best, if you're not sure, to go with a more broad umbrella term like trans and gender diverse is the go. So it's not a bad word, and I think we can keep adding to language. Language evolves in so many ways, and so adding to it, no problem with that. And who knows, maybe transsexual won't ever be heard of again in, say, 20 years' time, but as long as it's here, it's valid.
Yeah.
The next question is from Maria, and Maria's asking, it's Maria again, is asking, is there a difference between gender fluid and non-binary?
Do you want me to take it?
You go for it.
Okay.
Close to you.
Sure. From my personal understanding, yes. My experience of being... Sometimes I experience gender fluidity within my non-binary-ness, if you can call it that. But they are, for me personally, distinct experiences. Do you want to speak any more to that, Sally?
Yeah, look, there is a sense of, none of us are static in that sense, even if we don't use any label in this area of transgender diverse, non-binary, gender fluid. We all have, I sometimes look at it that we all have a range of skills, and this is where I said earlier, for better or worse, that society calls masculine or feminine, very horrible, broad, generalised terms. People see the ability to do maths as masculine and empathy as feminine. And of course, that's a very limiting thing. We all have a range of skills that is unique. Because I'm feeling cheeky after a coffee, how many genders are there, Sally? 7 billion, one for everyone on the planet.
Exactly.
And we can shift our skills and maybe do feel what society arbitrarily puts, masculine with male, female as feminine, regardless of our body. We all have a unique combination of skills, and maybe we use them in different ways over time. And I suppose the more we can seamlessly use all those skills, the better off everyone is. So, yeah, I think there is some sense of fluidity in how people feel, and so long as it's, to quote one of my favourite philosopher's Batman. It's used for good and not evil purposes, Robin. That's the main thing.
Yeah. And
definitely.
finding out what things mean to the individual
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. Every term can have a different meaning to each person.
Because I have gender fluid and non-binary people in my life, and some people, I also know people who say gender queer, and they have a very different experience. So again, it's really just really kind of driving us towards more understanding individuals and moving away from those labels, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Sally said it really well before when you talked about curiosity, like approach anything that you hear with curiosity, and, you know, invite in that learning.
Beautiful,
Just to quickly, a way you might do that, if it's relevant, is to ask something like, okay, gender fluid, can I clarify so I can be really clear, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
That's a really affirming, respectful
Yes.
way, rather than using the person as the unwanted learning curve.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, beautiful. There's another question here I'd like to kind of tuck in. I would like to talk to a worker on our team who is transgender. I also want him to know that we support him 100%. Did either of you want to respond to that?
I will, and I might link in one of our closing slides.
About being an ally.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. This is where we can, now we've delved into all the transgender diverse non-binary, we draw it full circle, and whether the person's a client or a colleague, same things, just be affirming of the person, you know, sort of, how was your weekend? You know, what did you get up to? And the person might say, well, I went to an AFLW game, or they might say, I went to a trans support group meeting or something. And just, you know, be interested, the same as you would anyone else who said, I went to an AFLW game, or I went to see a band at the pub or something. That's the same thing. Be in the present moment, tap into their strengths, I suppose, is more client-based. But if the trans person's down, find out what interests them. There was a lovely, I mean, I'm going to really out myself here. I'm a fan of what's colloquially known as sports entertainment. And one day I was having a down period, and a friend just started asking me just to G me up about, why do I like it? Who are my favourites? Same thing with anyone. We're all trans and gender diverse people, are whole people. So I think that, you know, just to engage with that person as a person, and then if they feel they want to talk about trans but don't do it out of a sense of your own, I'll use the term nosiness, you know, that sort of thing. And also tapping in there can be similar-ish principles, I suppose, for someone who's a parent of a transgender diverse non-binary people, or a loved one, that sort of thing. Yeah,
great. I love that. Yeah.
So we'll just make sure we zap through the rest.
Thank you.
Yeah, trans people, you know, for all the challenges, great positivity. Hopefully you've endured some warped sense of humour for the last hour, but, you know, we do have it in there and can laugh at things about gender as well, and just how stupid it is sometimes all the same. But don't, if someone's in distress, do that, I think would be the safer rule. We wouldn't have our wonderful smartphones and all the technology we have that brings you this webinar without Lynn Conway. There's something to read up on. And that all about Women Festival. There's 3 awesome trans and gender diverse people. C.M. Lester, a non-binary person. Eddie Ayres, who's a classical music expert. Jordan Raskopoulos does funny clips on social media. So there's a range of people. It's a great webinar. I declare an interest. I had the easy job of facilitating that, and I was just sitting back going, oh, this is awesome.
I really enjoyed that, actually. I watched it.
Yeah, so lots of good insights there. We've covered pronouns, forms.
Can I just speak to pronouns for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Because Sheridan mentioned before preferred pronouns.
Yeah.
And I would say don't use the word preferred. Just say pronouns. It's not a preference. It's, you know, it's what we use.
Yeah.
That's my
Parallel to why we use, say, sexual or romantic orientation, sexual preference is, you know, not a preference, whether you're hetero, gay, lesbian, bi, pan, etc. Yep. There's a good resource that really dives into pronouns, put together by the Sydney-based national organisation LGBTI Health Alliance, the critical tips in colour. People have probably seen variations of this. I do think overall it's a good visual. Where does the second slide fall down? How does that person in the light blue shirt get onto the second box?
Yeah.
Who helps them up there? And as a trained accountant, that is terrible occupational health and safety to have people standing on wooden boxes. So the third slide gets rid of the barrier being the wooden fence and just says, hey, there's still some protection there and some support. You won't get hit in the face or the tummy with a flying baseball, but now everyone can just stand on level ground. So it's a really, I think it's a good visual. It doesn't solve everything. We've still got to work to get to that third slide, but at least it shows us what we're trying to do for all people. So have a think about it as you go away today. What do we do next? You know, momentum is really important, and once that keeps going, then away we go. That's how you can contact Christy or myself by that general address and just say, oh, I was on the webinar and had another question if you want to, or get in touch with Sheridan, and that's Transgender Victoria's contacts. But I know for me, as someone who's, you know, for a long time, trans people weren't asked about what worked for us. You're all here. You've asked us. Simply hooray and thank you from me. Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. That is all we've got time. Oh, we've done the live question, so that's great. We've done that, but it is all we've got time for as well now. So, and I know there were a few more questions that were there, but hopefully that's given you some insight and some things to think about. But as I said at the beginning, obviously we don't think that you're going to finish up today feeling like an expert. We hope you feel a little bit inspired and really, you know, excited about learning more and working differently with trans and gender diverse people, and knowing that you can, you know, really serve them as well and really provide access. I want to, just to wrap up, oh, I've lost my slide. Oh, it's gone. Okay. I want to quickly let you know that the next webinar is on the 3rd of March, and that's being presented. It's on opioids. So if you want to check in on that one, it's a really important topic, and that one's up, you know, ready to be registered now. And please also, if you could take a moment to quickly fill in the survey. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thank you so much for all your questions, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.